The days that followed blurred into one another in a haze of exhaustion, tension, and the silent dread that seemed to seep into every steel plate of the USS Cyclops. By this point in the voyage, no man aboard the ship could pretend that everything was normal. Their bodies moved through routines, their hands performed tasks they had done 1,000 times, but their minds remained fixed on the same unspoken truth. Something had shifted irreversibly, and they were now trapped in a world where logic, safety, and command were slipping further away with each passing hour. In the early light of each morning, the ocean appeared calm, almost serene. The waves rolled gently beneath the hull, and the sky stretched above them in an endless expanse of blue. To anyone watching from afar, the Cyclops would have appeared as steady and unthreatened as ever, a fortress of steel gliding confidently across the Atlantic. But to the men aboard, the ship no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like an island drifting without anchor or direction, ruled by a man who seemed less and less tethered to reality. Captain George W. Worley's descent continued in ways large and small, visible and invisible. His appearance began to change. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes, his complexion grew sallow, and his shoulders, once squared with the confidence of command, now sagged under an invisible weight. His voice shifted too. Sometimes it crackled with anger, sharp and sudden. Other times it softened into a whisper, as though he was speaking not to the crew but to someone only he could hear. He no longer trusted his officers. He no longer trusted the crew. He no longer trusted the machinery, the sea, the charts, or the silence. He trusted only himself, and even that trust appeared fragile. One morning he emerged from his cabin abruptly, wearing only his undershirt, his boots unlaced, his eyes wild with something between confusion and fury. He stormed onto the bridge and demanded to know why the ship had turned south during the night. The officers stared at him, baffled. The Cyclops had not turned south. It had been following its course faithfully. The charts confirmed it. The readings confirmed it. The men confirmed it. But Worley did not believe them. He insisted the ship had shifted direction. He pointed to the horizon and claimed it looked different. He argued that they were being led astray, sabotaged by someone aboard who wanted to deliver the ship to the enemy. When the officers tried to reason with him, showing him the instruments, the navigation readings, the logs, he dismissed everything with a wave of his hand, muttering that charts could be doctored and instruments rigged. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The truth was no longer something they could avoid. The captain had lost the ability to distinguish reality from his own fears, and the ship, massive, heavy, loaded to the brink, was moving through dangerous waters under the command of a man who saw ghosts in every corner. Whispers of mutiny grew louder, though still too dangerous to voice openly. The crew knew the risks. Mutiny was punishable by death. But staying under the command of a captain whose judgment had crumbled felt no less deadly. The men were split not by loyalty or ideology but by fear. Some believed that any attempt to remove the captain would only provoke him further, pushing him into even more dangerous behavior. Others believed they had a moral duty to stop him before he led them to ruin. In the end, fear won. They did nothing, and the ship sailed on. The ocean around them grew darker as they moved north. Clouds gathered in thick formations overhead, casting a heavy shadow across the steel deck. The waves grew taller, pushed by winds that came in sudden bursts. The air felt heavier, as though charged with electricity. Nature itself seemed to mirror the turmoil aboard the ship. During one particularly tense evening, the chief engineer, still confined to quarters after Worley's irrational accusations, called for an officer to deliver a message. When the officer arrived, he found the engineer pale and sweating, his hands trembling. "This cannot continue," the engineer said in a whisper. "Something is going to break." The officer nodded. He knew. Everyone aboard knew. The next morning, the ship encountered a swell strong enough to jolt men from their bunks. The Cyclops groaned under the weight of its cargo, the metal beneath their feet vibrating with an ominous hum. Worley rushed to the deck, shouting orders to steady the ship. His commands were frantic, disjointed, contradictory. Officers attempted to follow them but quickly realized the captain was reacting not to the conditions but to some internal panic. His orders would have put the ship in greater danger. One officer, the first mate, stepped in, speaking firmly but respectfully. "Captain, I recommend we hold our course and throttle back slightly. The storm front is mild. There is no imminent risk." Worley spun toward him, eyes burning with fury. "You're lying," he hissed. "You're all lying. You want this ship to fall apart under me." The first mate held his ground, but the moment fractured something between them. From that point forward, the captain treated the officer as a traitor. He scrutinized his every move, questioned every recommendation, and watched him with a suspicion so intense that even the crew felt it sting. Later that day, the captain summoned several officers into the chart room and locked the door behind them. He confronted them with a barrage of accusations. They were plotting to overthrow him, plotting to reroute the ship, plotting to sabotage the engines. His voice rose and fell erratically. He slammed his hand against the table so violently that the compass jumped again. The officers protested, but reason no longer reached him. When he finally dismissed them, the men walked out shaken, certain that the captain was spiraling into something far darker than simple paranoia. They considered making a decision. They considered taking control. They considered saving the ship by force, but once again, they did nothing. and the Cyclops continued its journey toward a horizon none of them could see clearly anymore. Nightfall brought a strange quiet. The sea calmed, the wind softened, the stars appeared in a wide, bright canopy overhead. For a moment it felt as though the world was holding its breath. Then, in the stillness, a scream tore through the lower decks. Men scrambled from their bunks, rushing toward the sound. They found a sailor standing frozen near the storage compartments, his eyes wide with terror. When they asked him what happened, he pointed toward a darkened corridor and stammered incoherently. The captain had appeared behind him without warning, he said, standing in the shadows, watching him silently. The sailor had turned and nearly collided with Worley, who whispered something in German before disappearing again into the dark. Some believed the sailor was exhausted, imagining things. Others believed him fully. But everyone felt the same knot tighten inside their stomachs. The captain was no longer merely unstable. He was becoming something else, something unpredictable and ghost-like. A presence that seemed to materialize at random, as if haunted by forces the crew could not see. As the days dragged on, more strange incidents unfolded. A lifeboat, secured tightly the previous evening, was found partially unlatched at dawn. No one claimed responsibility. No one admitted tampering with it. Some believed the captain had done it. Others feared it was the action of a sailor preparing an escape. Worley himself accused 2 men of trying to flee the ship. They denied it vehemently, but the captain's accusations left a chill across the deck. Another night, a lantern in the cargo hold shattered without explanation, plunging the area into darkness. The men who found it swore they heard footsteps retreating, but no one could be found. Worley blamed sabotage. Officers suspected the lantern simply fell. The crew whispered of something else, something the ocean itself was doing to them. The tension, the fear, the isolation were twisting every sound, every shadow, every movement into something sinister. Sleep became an enemy. Men lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, listening to the groaning of the ship, the hum of the engines, the steps of the captain pacing endlessly above them. Distinguishing real sounds from imagined ones became harder each night. And then came the message. A routine radio transmission, sent from the Cyclops toward the mainland, was received without any indication of distress. It was simple, ordinary, the kind of communication ships had used countless times. It offered no clue that anything was wrong. Afterward, silence followed. What the men aboard did not yet know, and what the world would later agonize over, was that this would be the last confirmed communication from the Cyclops. Soon after, the atmosphere aboard the ship shifted in a way that none of the men could fully describe. The tension became more than psychological, it became physical. The air felt heavier, thicker. The ship's movements felt strange, as though subtle forces nudged at the hull from below. The steel groaned more often. Floors vibrated with new, unpredictable rhythms. Even the lights seemed dimmer, the shadows darker, the nights longer. Worley became nearly impossible to predict. One moment he commanded with icy clarity, the next he erupted in rage. Then he fell into a deep, unnerving silence. He accused sailors of treason, of espionage, of plotting to kill him. He locked himself in his cabin for hours, then emerged, pacing the hallways, sometimes barefoot, sometimes armed, sometimes whispering in a language few could understand. The crew felt trapped, not just by the sea, but by the man who led them and the fear that surrounded him. They were days, perhaps less, from reaching the area where reports would later place the ship's last known position. But the men aboard did not know that. They only knew they felt something closing in around them, something they could not name, something that felt final. The sky darkened earlier than expected on what would become one of the most memorable nights aboard the Cyclops. Clouds gathered in thick swarms, turning the horizon into a deep, bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant rain. The ocean churned uneasily. Men climbed to the deck to secure equipment, lash barrels, and reinforce lines. The storm seemed moderate, nothing unusual, nothing catastrophic. Yet the air buzzed with a sense of impending crisis. The captain stood on the bridge, watching the horizon with an expression that frightened the officers. He murmured something, but no one could hear. When one man asked if they should alter course, Worley turned sharply, eyes narrowed, and snapped that the ship was already being followed by enemies. He pointed toward the dark water, claiming he saw shapes moving beneath the surface, but no one else saw anything. The officers exchanged glances that mixed doubt with fear. They wondered how long they could follow orders given by a man who no longer trusted his senses, but they acted as they always had, cautiously, quietly, and without confrontation. As the storm approached, the ship creaked loudly under the shifting pressure. The waves slapped against the hull with force. Rain began to fall, a fine mist at first, then growing heavier. The lamps flickered, the deck shuddered. Men braced themselves. The Cyclops continued forward, slow and steady, heavy with cargo and heavier with dread. And above them, in the bridge, the captain stared into the darkness as though searching for an answer hidden in the storm, an answer that had been chasing him long before the sea ever did. The night ahead would change everything. But for now, the ship pressed on into the swirling shadows, carrying its crew deeper into the unfolding mystery, one step closer to the moment where history would lose track of them forever. The night that followed felt heavier than any before it. The sky above the Cyclops had turned into a massive black dome with only faint, trembling stars piercing through the darkness. The air tasted metallic, thick, and strangely warm, as though the atmosphere itself were pressing down on the ship. Nothing about the weather predicted disaster nor hurricane winds. No towering waves. No raging storm, but the men aboard sensed something shifting around them in ways that could not be measured by barometers or charts. It was a tension that seemed to come from the ship itself, from the steel, from the darkness, from the man who commanded them. Captain George W. Worley had barely slept in days. His steps had become unsteady, his gaze distant, unfocused, yet sharp in disturbing flashes. In the glow of lanterns, his face carried the hollowed, almost gaunt look of someone who had been awake far longer than a human mind could safely endure. And as the ship continued its march through the Atlantic, he appeared to slip deeper into a mindspace where every shadow signaled danger and every whisper signaled betrayal. He walked the corridors with a lantern in hand, the flame catching the metal walls and casting warped reflections that followed him like ghostly silhouettes. Sailors lying in their bunks pretended to sleep as he passed, holding their breath, terrified that the captain might pause at their doorway, stare into their cabin, or demand answers to questions they did not understand. His presence had become a force unpredictable, oppressive, almost spectral. At one point during the night, a sailor on watch spotted the captain standing at the bow, staring into the blackness. The sailor approached cautiously, unsure whether to announce himself or remain silent. But as he drew closer, he noticed that Worley wasn't just staring, he was trembling. His hands gripped the rail so tightly that his knuckles looked bloodless, bone-white in the dim lantern light. His lips moved as if he were whispering something into the wind. The sailor strained his ears but could only make out fragments, German words, spoken with the softness of memory and the sharpness of fear. The sailor retreated quickly, heart-pounding. He returned to the lower deck and whispered to his companions, who listened with a sickening sense of confirmation. Whatever was happening to the captain was not just stress or exhaustion. It was something much deeper, something that had been simmering for years and was now burning its way to the surface. By dawn, the crew moved through their routines with the robotic precision of men trying to survive a day at a time. The air was humid, the sky overcast, and the sea took on a darker, more leaden color. The horizon was a smudged gray line, barely distinguishable from the ocean itself. The ship felt unusually still between swells, and the sound of the engines seemed muted, as though absorbed by the vastness of the water. After breakfast, an incident occurred that would become one of the last moments the crew later remembered with disturbing clarity. Two sailors were securing cargo lines near the forward hold when the captain appeared behind them without a sound. When they noticed him, they froze, startled by the suddenness of his presence. "What are you doing there?" he asked sharply. "We're reinforcing the straps." "Sir," one of them replied cautiously. "Who told you to do that?" "The first mate." Sir Worley's expression hardened. His breathing grew audible, irregular. "The first mate," he repeated, as though the words themselves were a provocation. "The first mate is interfering with the ship's balance. He is undermining order." The sailors exchanged terrified glances. They tried to explain the orders calmly, but Worley cut them off. "You two step back. Leave it. Leave all of it. I'll handle this." They obeyed, retreating down the corridor as quickly as they dared. Later, one of them admitted that Worley's eyes had looked empty in a way that did not resemble anger or fatigue, but something far more disturbing, as if reason had been stripped away, leaving only compulsion and mistrust.
Throughout the day, the captain's behavior escalated unpredictably. He ordered half the crew to resecure parts of the deck that were already secure. He demanded that the helmsman alter course repeatedly, even when the changes put the ship at odds with expected navigation patterns. He accused two officers of plotting a coup, then later denied he had said anything at all. At lunch, he left the wardroom abruptly after staring at his food with suspicion for several minutes, convinced someone had tampered with it. Officers held private conversations behind locked doors. They spoke in low voices that trembled with frustration, fear, and guilt. They knew the man in command was no longer functional. They knew the ship's safety was at risk. They knew they had the authority to relieve him if they could prove he was mentally unfit. But they also knew the consequences of mutiny in wartime, consequences that could follow them long after landfall if they ever reached land again. And so the ship continued under the command of a man unraveling before their eyes. That afternoon, as the ship cut through uneven swells, a lookout spotted something floating in the water debris of some kind, though hard to identify. He called the bridge, reporting what he saw. Worley reacted with an intensity no one expected. He rushed to the deck, stared at the drifting object, and declared it a sign. A warning, he said.
The officers tried to reason with him. It could have been driftwood, trash from another vessel, cargo lost at sea. But Worley insisted it was a sign and omen that they were being followed, hunted, watched. His voice rose until it echoed across the steel deck. Officers tried to calm him, but he brushed them aside, gripping the railing until his fingers turned white. To the crew, it was the moment when the ocean itself seemed to whisper that the captain's mind had crossed a threshold from which it would not return. That night, the ship entered a stretch of water where the sky grew strangely clear. Stars shimmered in the black expanse above, and the ocean reflected them like a dark mirror. The world felt still, suspended, as if time itself hesitated. The men aboard slept fitfully, nightmares mingling with the low hum of engines. The captain walked the decks again, lantern swaying in his hand, shadows shifting around him. At one point he stopped near the stern and looked down into the water. A sailor who observed him from a distance later described it as one of the eeriest moments he had ever witnessed. Worley leaned forward, as if mesmerized by something below the surface. His posture became rigid, his breathing shallow. Then he whispered, "I see you." No one else saw anything. The sailor backed away slowly, heart racing, certain that the captain was speaking not to the ocean but to something inside his own mind. As dawn approached, the ocean flattened. The air grew warm and still. A fog began to rise thin at first, then thickening in a pale, eerie veil that clung to the ship. Visibility dwindled. Sound became muffled. The crew moved slowly through the haze, their silhouettes dissolving in the white air. It felt surreal, dreamlike, as though the ship had entered a world halfway between waking and sleeping. In that fog, the captain's voice seemed to travel strangely. He barked orders that echoed in unnatural ways, drifting through the mist like disembodied commands. Sailors could hear him even when they could not see him. His presence felt multiplied, scattered in the haze, amplified by fear and imagination. During the late morning, the fog lifted gradually, revealing an ocean as smooth as glass. The men gathered on deck, relieved to see the sky again. But the relief was short-lived. The captain appeared from the upper level, eyes sunken, jaw tight, and announced that the ship was being followed. He pointed to a stretch of empty ocean. "There," he said. "They're watching us." The officers looked. The crew looked. There was nothing. Water and sky. Nothing more. But Worley insisted. He claimed he had seen periscopes earlier. He claimed he had heard signals. He claimed he had intercepted coded messages. When the radio man checked the equipment, everything was normal. Worley accused him of tampering. He struck the chart table with his fist so hard that a map slid to the floor. Later that day, the ship encountered a swell that rocked the vessel more violently than before. The cargo shifted. For a moment, the steel ribs of the ship groaned with a low, ominous vibration. Men clung to rails. One sailor was thrown against a wall hard enough to crack a rib. Worley burst onto the deck, shouting that someone had destabilized the cargo intentionally. He ordered a full inspection. He accused the nearest officer of negligence. He threatened to imprison half the deck crew. The officers tried to explain that the swell was responsible, that the ship remained stable. But Worley heard only betrayal, only danger, only conspiracies forming in the shadows. The psychological descent that had been unfolding quietly for weeks had now become a freefall. And the crew, trapped between loyalty, fear, and survival, felt themselves slipping alongside him. That night, the engines faltered briefly, only a moment, only a slight dip in rhythm, caused by nothing more than a standard mechanical fluctuation. But to the captain it was not a moment, it was an attack. He stormed into the engine room accusing mechanics of sabotage. Voices escalated. The men pleaded that the engines were functioning normally. Worley refused to listen. "You want this ship to die," he shouted. "You want me to die." And then, with a trembling voice, barely audible, "You want the past to consume us." The engineers stared at one another, shaken. None understood what he meant, but the words echoed in their minds long after the captain left. By then, the ship had traveled far from any known shipping lanes. The ocean around them was quiet, empty, infinite. The radio remained silent, and the fog that had lifted earlier began to gather once more, as if the world around them was slowly erasing itself. The last night before the Cyclops vanished was unlike any the crew had experienced. The fog thickened to an unnatural degree, swallowing light, swallowing sound. Lanterns glowed like faint, floating orbs. Men moved cautiously, speaking little, knowing instinctively that they were approaching something irreversible. In the early hours before dawn, several sailors awoke to the sound of footsteps, low, deliberate, uneven. When they peered out from their bunks, they saw the captain walking down the corridor, lantern in hand, face half-lit, expression hollow. He paused in the middle of the hallway. "I won't let them take us," he whispered. No one knew who they were. He turned slowly. his eyes meeting the gaze of a sailor watching him from the shadows. "It won't be them," he said softly. "Not this time." Then he walked away, disappearing into the fog that seeped through the corridor, drifting like a living thing. By dawn, the fog swallowed the horizon completely. The ocean vanished. The sky vanished. The world became a pale, indistinct sphere in which the ship drifted like a ghost. No radio message came, no distress signal, no final report, only silence. A silence so deep that it felt as though the sea had closed over their heads, sealing their fate long before the world realized they were gone. And somewhere aboard that drifting vessel, Captain George W. Worley Johann Friedrich Georg Wichmann stood alone in the fog, carrying a lifetime of secrets into a darkness no man aboard would ever escape. The fog that surrounded the Cyclops that morning was unlike anything the crew had seen before. It was not the thin, shifting veil that drifted lazily across the ocean on humid days. It was a thick, suffocating shroud, a wall of white so dense that the ship seemed to float in a void. Men could not see from bow to stern. Sound carried strangely, echoing back in hollow, distorted tones. The world outside the railings simply ceased to exist. In that eerie stillness, the Cyclops moved forward at a crawl, engines humming softly. They walked the deck feeling as though they were the last people alive, navigating nothing more than a dream or a nightmare. The sailors tried to perform their duties, but fear clung to them like moisture in the air. Their movements were slow, cautious. Every clang of metal, every groan of the hull, every distant noise made them flinch. No one dared speak more than a whisper. No one wanted to disturb whatever invisible force seemed to be hovering around them. Captain Worley, however, seemed energized by the fog. It was as if the world collapsing into white had validated everything he had feared, everything he had insisted upon. His paranoia sharpened, his suspicions hardened. He moved through the ship with an uncanny stillness, lantern in hand, his silhouette materializing and vanishing as he walked in and out of the fog that seeped into every corridor. He called the officers to the bridge early that morning. They assembled in silence, the fog outside the windows swirling like smoke from a dying fire. Worley stood near the helm, gripping the rail, his eyes wide and glassy. "They are here," he said simply. The first officer hesitated before responding. "Captain, we see no ships, no lights, no movements. The fog is—" "You think fog hides nothing," Worley interrupted. "You think they don't know how to use it. They are watching. Watching all of you." The officers exchanged glances, careful, controlled, yet filled with fear. None dared contradict him. None dared argue. He dismissed them abruptly, claiming he needed to listen to the silence. The day dragged on, each hour merging into the next with no change in light, no shift in temperature, no sign of the world beyond the ship. Men wandered the decks like ghosts, disoriented by the endless whiteness. Some reported hearing distant knock-soft taps on the hull that seemed to come from beneath the water. Others heard whispers in the fog, carried by wind or imagined by minds pushed to their breaking point. The strangest phenomenon of all occurred near noon, when several sailors swore the ocean beneath them had turned unnaturally still. No waves lapped against the hull. No swells lifted the bow. It felt like the ship had entered a vast, motionless pool where the sea itself held its breath. The men spoke of it later, as the moment the world seemed to pause, as if time were waiting for something to happen. That afternoon, tensions exploded. A confrontation broke out between two sailors near the aft deck, both exhausted, frightened, and stretched to their mental limits. Shouts echoed through the fog. One accused the other of reporting information to the captain. The other retaliated, calling him a coward. The argument nearly turned violent before officers intervened, separating them and forcing them below deck. But the damage was done. Panic began to spread. The fog did not lift. The silence deepened, and the captain grew stranger. Shortly after the fight, Worley ordered the engines to slow to a near-idle pace. Men felt the ship shudder beneath them as the vibrations softened. The Cyclops drifted forward like a phantom, the water barely disturbed by its movements. From the upper deck, a deep resonant sound echoed across the ship, low and drawn out, like the moan of something ancient rising from the deep. The men froze. Some thought it was the hull shifting. Others believed it was thunder, but there was no lightning, no wind, no waves, just fog in that sound. Moments later, the ship lurched slightly to one side, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to send a ripple of unease through the crew. Some men swore they felt a vibration beneath their feet, as though something enormous had moved under the water. The ocean returned to silence. The fog remained. Worley appeared on deck seconds later, lantern held high, his face pale and rigid. "You heard them," he said, his voice trembling. "Now you believe." The men backed away from him, terrified not of the fog, not of the ocean, but of the man whose mind had now fully turned against itself. As the night deepened, so did the fear. No one slept. No one spoke above a whisper. No one dared speculate what the captain believed he was hearing. In the darkest hours before dawn, the first mate found himself pacing the wardroom, unable to shake the fear that they were approaching a point beyond return. He knew the ship was dangerously off course. He knew fuel reserves were lower than they should have been. He knew the storm of the captain's mind had reached its full force. He also knew that if they didn't act soon, they might not survive. He summoned courage, thin, brittle courage, and knocked on the cabin of the chief engineer, who had been reluctantly released from confinement earlier that day. They spoke in whispers, their shadows flickering in lantern light. "We must relieve him," the first mate said. "We must." The engineer nodded slowly. "But how?" "The men fear him. And if we are wrong, if we do nothing," the first mate replied, "we may all die." They planned quietly, carefully. They would approach the other officers. They would document the captain's instability. They would wait for the right moment to address him collectively, to demand he step aside. It was a risk great, deadly, unforgivable if mishandled, but they were out of time before they could act. However, the fog began to change. A faint glow, barely perceptible, spread across the horizon. Not dawn, not lightning, something else. Something pale, diffused, unnatural. The ship drifted toward it slowly, as though drawn by an unseen current. Men climbed to the deck, squinting into the haze. The light grew brighter, but not clearer. It was a glow without source, a brightness without shape, like the ocean itself had illuminated from below. The captain appeared among them, lantern in hand. "You see," he whispered, "they are here." No one spoke. The men watched as the Cyclops drifted deeper into the glowing fog. The air vibrated faintly. The steel railing felt warm beneath their hands. The silence grew so intense that men could hear their own hearts pounding. The glow brightened again. Then, without warning, the engines flickered once, twice before roaring back to life with a force that shook the entire ship. Men stumbled. Tools clattered. Plates fell. The fog swirled violently, spiraling around the deck. "Who started the engines?" an officer shouted. No one had touched the controls. The ship surged forward. Worley staggered, lantern swinging. And then, in a voice that carried through the fog like a final prophecy, he said, "It's too late." The glow intensified, engulfing them, swallowing the deck, the mast, the stars, the sky. And in that blinding whiteness, the Cyclops moved toward a fate no man aboard could understand and no man on land would ever be able to explain. The world dissolved into white. The fog that swallowed the Cyclops was no longer the pale shroud that had drifted around them for hours. It had grown brighter, denser, until the ship moved through a luminous void that erased everything familiar. Men could not see their own hands in front of them. The deck vanished beneath their feet. The sky disappeared above. The ocean below ceased to exist. There was only brightness, soft, blinding, enveloping. Some sailors shouted. Others froze where they stood. A few dropped to their knees, clutching the rail or the deck, overwhelmed by the sensation that the world had gone weightless. The hum of the engines vibrated through their bones. But even that familiar sound felt distant, distorted, as though echoing from another dimension. No wind, no horizon, no sound except the low thrum of the steel beneath them. The first mate stumbled across the deck, calling for officers. His voice sounded muted, smothered by the brightness. He reached for the captain, but hesitated because Worley was smiling. It was not a smile of relief, not a smile of joy. It was the chilling smile of someone who believed he had been proven right, vindicated, justified. His eyes glistened with a strange light, reflecting the glow around them. "I told you," he whispered. Then louder, "I told all of you." They were waiting. The crew stared at him, terrified not by what he said but by how calmly he said it, how naturally he embraced the impossible scene unfolding around them. The captain stepped toward the bow, lantern still in his hand, though the glow made it useless. He lifted it as if offering it to the wide abyss. "They followed us," he continued. "They called us here." No one knew what he meant. No one dared ask. The brightness intensified again briefly, painfully forcing men to shield their eyes. The air warmed. The deck vibrated with a low resonant pulse like a heartbeat rising from the sea. Some sailors felt the hairs on their arms lift, as if charged by static. Others felt the deck tilt slightly, not from a wave but from something deeper, a shift in the water itself. And then, as suddenly as the brightness had intensified, it began to recede. Not all at once. Slowly, gradually, like a curtain being drawn back millimeter by millimeter, shapes emerged. Shadows returned. The deck regained its solidity. The sky reappeared in fragments, dark gray pieces visible through thin cracks in the fog. The ocean returned last. When it did, it was wrong. Very wrong. The water below the Cyclops was darker than any man aboard had ever seen, an almost black, glassy surface that reflected nothing. No stars, no sky, no lanterns. It looked bottomless, void-like, as though the ship were floating above an abyss deeper than the sea itself. Men murmured prayers, others clutched railings, shaking uncontrollably. The officers looked at one another with pale faces, realizing that the ship had drifted far beyond any familiar charted waters. The compass spun sluggishly, unable to settle on a direction. The barometer flickered erratically. The air tasted metallic and faintly sweet, like something unnatural had seeped into the atmosphere. Only Worley remained composed. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. "Now you understand." The sailors backed away from him, fearful of what he might do or what he might ask of them. The first mate stepped forward, gathering the courage he had been trying to muster for days. "Captain, we need to return to course." The ship is where it needs to be," Worley interrupted. "This is where they brought us." The first mate swallowed hard. "Captain, we can't see land. We don't know our position." The instruments lie," Worley snapped. He leaned in close. So close the first mate could see the feverish shimmer in his eyes. "But I don't." Before the first mate could reply, a sound echoed across the water, a deep, resonant tone, like the one they had heard the previous night, but louder, closer. It vibrated through the hull, through the men's chests, through their bones. Some stumbled. Others covered their ears. The darkness beneath the ship rippled unnaturally, as if something massive had moved beneath the surface. The fog thickened again, not luminous this time, but heavy, oppressive, swallowing the world in gray. The glowing light was gone, replaced by a dim, suffocating veil. The ship rolled slightly, though the sea was impossibly calm. The first mate reached for the railing to steady himself and nearly cried out. The metal was warm, warm like skin, warm like something alive. He stepped back, heart racing, unsure whether to tell the others what he felt, but several sailors had already noticed. "The ship's hot," one whispered. "Feel it. The steel is warm. Maybe the engines are overheating." Another said. "No," the first answered. "It's not the engines." Because the warmth was not coming from below, it was coming from everywhere. The railings, the deck, the walls, the very air seemed thick with heat. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the warmth vanished. The steel cooled instantly, becoming normal again. The fog wavered, the darkness beneath them softened. The strange sensations passed like a dream, but the fear remained. That evening the officers met in the wardroom with the doors locked. Their voices trembled as they argued. Some demanded action. Others warned that confronting the captain in this state might provoke him into violence or worse. The chief engineer insisted they check the engines. The radio man begged for permission to send a signal, any signal, even if the captain forbade it. The first mate suggested that they quietly relieve the captain and place him in confinement until they returned to land. "But land where?" another officer whispered. "We don't even know where we are." Silence followed. A heavy silence filled with dread. Outside the wardroom the ship creaked. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. The ocean whispered below them, carrying the faint sound of distant, rhythmic pulses, too deep to identify, too regular to ignore. Suddenly, footsteps approached the wardroom, slow, heavy, purposeful. The officers froze. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then Worley's voice came through the wood, soft and calm. "You don't have to hide from me." The officers glanced at one another, terrified. "I already know," the captain continued. Then silence. Footsteps receded. The men exhaled shakily, some collapsing into chairs, others wiping sweat from their brows. They had run out of time. By dawn, the fog had changed again, this time thinning into streaks that drifted low over the water like ghostly tendrils. The sky was visible in patches, but the horizon remained obscured. The sun rose weakly, filtered through haze that made everything appear muted and pale. The ocean was calm. To calm. The men scanned the waters nervously. Some swore they saw shadows below the surface, long dark shapes gliding in slow arcs, too large to be fish, too fluid to be debris. Others insisted it was imagination. But the silence of the sea was wrong. It held no birds, no distant waves, no wind, just stillness. And then something impossible happened. A ripple formed in the water beside the ship, a single, perfect circle spreading outward, then another, and another, as if something enormous were rising from the deep slowly, deliberately, but nothing broke the surface. The ripples continued, precise, steady, growing wider. Men backed away from the railings. Some muttered prayers. Others whispered Worley's name as though he were cursed, or cursed them all. Worley himself appeared moments later, stepping onto the deck with a serene calm that no one else felt. "It's starting," he said. He stared at the water, eyes unblinking, face pale. "They're calling." The word echoed across the ship, sending a chill through every man who heard it. Calling. Was it paranoia, madness, something in his mind breaking fully at last? Or was there something in the ocean, something that had been waiting? Before anyone could speak, the engine sputtered. Once, twice, then died. The ship fell into a dead drift. Silence, fog creeping along the deck. Dark water swirling below, crewmen frozen in place, the captain standing perfectly still, lantern in hand, looking down into the abyss. The Cyclops no longer moved, no longer hummed, no longer lived, and every man aboard felt it, deep in his bones. Whatever was coming next was the moment their fate would be decided. The engines of the Cyclops had gone silent. The sudden absence of vibration felt like the ship itself had exhaled its last breath. The stillness that followed was unnerving, deep, complete, unnatural. It was not the peaceful calm of a ship at rest, but the suffocating quiet of something that had been stopped, halted, suspended. Men stood frozen across the deck, the fog coiling around their legs like pale smoke. No one dared speak, no one dared move. The ocean beneath them remained impossibly calm. That same dark, glass-like surface that had emerged after the luminous fog receded. It reflected nothing, swallowed sound, and seemed to expand forever in every direction. Captain George W. Worley stood near the bow, lantern dangling from his hand, the flame flickering weakly in the thick air. His posture was rigid, his face pale but resolute, as if he had accepted something long before the others had sensed it. He stared into the water with an expression that blended awe and terror, recognition and surrender. The first mate approached him cautiously, voice trembling. "Captain, we need to restart the engines." Worley didn't turn his head. "You won't. We have to," the mate insisted. "We're drifting. We have no coordinates." "Where you won't start them," Worley repeated softly. "They won't allow it." The first mate felt his chest tighten. "Who is they?" "Sir." Worley's grip tightened on the lantern. "The ones who've been following us." Before the mate could respond, deep pulse vibrated through the hull, subtle at first, then stronger, a low-frequency rumble that traveled through the steel and into the bones of every man aboard. The ship shuddered slightly, though there were no waves, no swell, no external force. The men stared at one another, panic spreading silently. The pulse came again, then again. The water beneath the ship rippled outward in perfect circles, expanding across the black surface until they faded into the fog at the edges of visibility. The chief engineer ran toward the stairs, shouting for volunteers to check the engine room, but several sailors grabbed his arm, begging him not to go below. Their voices cracked with fear. "Something's down there," one whispered. "No sound from the machinery," another said. "The air feels wrong," a third muttered. But the engineer broke free and disappeared into the dim stairwell, two men following reluctantly. The ship swallowed their footsteps. Moments later, a metallic clang echoed through the hull, sharp, jarring like a hammer striking steel. Then silence. The first mate nearly ran after them, but stopped when a new sensation washed across the deck, a sudden drop in temperature, so abrupt that men exhaled clouds of vapor. The cold did not feel like normal weather. It felt as if something huge had drained the heat from the air. From the fog at the starboard side, a faint glow began to appear, not white this time, but a dull, bluish tint, flickering gently like distant lightning trapped within the mist. Men backed away. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers to gods they had not spoken to in years. The glow grew brighter. A low groan rose from the hulong, mournful, metallic, as though the ship itself felt the presence approaching. The deck vibrated again. Tools rattled. Loose ropes shook. A lantern swung wildly on its hook. Then, from beneath the water, a shadow appeared. It was not a shape, not something with form or agency, but a darkness darker than the sea itself, rising slowly, impossibly, toward the surface. The men watched in petrified silence, unsure if what they saw was real or a collective hallucination born of fear and exhaustion. But the shadow grew, and rose, and spread. The water around the ship began to circle, forming a slow whirlpool that pulled gently at the hull. Not enough to tip it, not enough to threaten it yet, but enough for every man aboard to feel the shift in balance. One sailor's voice cracked in terror. "What is that?" The captain answered without looking away. "It's what's been following us." His voice was calm, too calm. The first mate stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer. "Captain, we need to turn the engines back on right now. Whatever is happening, we cannot stay here." Worley finally turned to face him. The look in his eyes chilled the mate to the core. "This ship was never meant to return," Worley said. "Not with what we carry. Not with who I am." The mate recoiled. "Sir, that what are you saying?" Worley inhaled sharply, as though revealing something he had kept buried for decades. "They know what I was, who I was. That I lied to everyone. That I tried to outrun it." His voice tightened, trembling. "You can't outrun the past forever." The mate shook his head, fighting panic, trying to pull the captain back to reality. "This isn't about the past. This is..." He never finished the sentence. At that moment, a violent jolt rocked the ship. Men screamed as they fell to the deck. The fog burst inward like a crashing wave, swirling around them with a force that sent lanterns flying and ropes snapping. The shadow beneath the water surged upward, faster, closer, larger, until the entire ocean around the Cyclops seemed to bulge and rise. The engines roared back to life. No one had touched them. The men scrambled as the deck vibrated wildly. Tools flew, crates slid. The ship lurched forward with sudden, unnatural acceleration. "What's happening?" a sailor cried. The first mate tried to reach the helm, but the wheel spun wildly, uncontrolled, as though moved by unseen hands. The ship veered sharply to port, then to starboard, then straight ahead again, sliding across the dark water like a toy caught in a current no one could see. The crew clung to anything they could hold as the fog thickened, the shadow rose, and the ship sped into nothingness. From the bow, the captain shouted over the chaos, "Do not fear it. It's only the end coming." The first mate shouted back, voice cracking, "Captain STOP." But Worley raised his lantern high, eyes blazing. This is where it was always leading. The ship jolted again hard. A tearing sound ripped through the hull, deafening metallic final. Men were thrown across the deck. The mast shook violently. The world flickered between fog and shadow and brief fragments of sky, as though reality itself was stuttering. The darkness below surged upward one last time. A roar deep, massive, not of machine or beast, but of the ocean itself engulfed the ship. And then, silence. For an instant a blinding white light swallowed everything. The fog collapsed inward. The sea swallowed a shape, and when the world settled, there was nothing. No ship, no men, no debris, no oil slick, no sound, no trace. Just the ocean, calm and dark as it had been before, stretching endlessly under an indifferent sky. The USS Cyclops was gone, a ship of more than 300 men, 10,000 tons of cargo. Steel beams thicker than a man's arm vanished without a single wave breaking where it had been. On land, days passed, weeks, no messages, no sightings, only silence. When the US Navy searched the sea, they found nothing. When families begged for explanations, there were none. When investigators reviewed every record, every communication, every clue, they discovered no enemy attack, no storm, no SOS, no mechanical failure sufficient to sink such a ship without a trace. It was as if the ocean had simply erased the Cyclops. And the captain who had tried to outrun his past, Johann Friedrich Georg Wichmann, reborn as George W. Worley, vanished with it, his final moments lost forever within the fog and the darkness. The greatest non-combat loss of life in US Navy history ended with no wreckage, no survivors, no answers, only questions, only speculation, only the quiet, eternal field of waves, and the memory of a man whose unraveling mind became forever entwined with the most enduring maritime mystery America has ever known.